I have a lot of newsmen asking me strange questions. Like, for instance, Mr. Gregory, if you were elected president of the United States, what's the first thing you would do? I thought the whole world knew if I was elected president of this country, the first thing I'd do is paint the White House black. This was Dick Gregory's response when speaking to a group of students at UCLA in the spring of 1968. His response was met with a few nervous laughs and some scattered claps. The second thing I'd do is bring all the boys home from Vietnam. This explains Dick Gregory's run for the president in a nutshell. Gregory would use these kind of jokes on the campaign trail and people never knew if he was serious or not. He would usually follow those statements up with something profound to make people think. According to Dick Gregory, he was actually the first black man to run for president, and although he didn't win, he set up a precedent that other black leaders would use. In addition to paving the way for black comedians and black politicians, Gregory was also a victim of FBI surveillance because of his voice. He became too powerful. This is the story of Dick Gregory and his 1968 presidential campaign. Gregory began telling jokes in the mid to late 50s while still in the Army. After leaving, Gregory continued to perform comedy, primarily in Chicago, but becoming a widely known national figure. What set Gregory apart from the other comedians at the time was his tendency to cover current events, particularly race. Gregory, along with Bill Cosby, Nipsey Russell, and Godfrey Cambridge, focused on the more traditional stand-up act we see today as opposed to the minstrel performances. Gregory was a trailblazer for his time. As celebrated as Gregory is, his act generated a lot of controversy because audiences weren't ready for what Gregory had to offer. It was too real. Author of the book, The Comedians, said that people felt politics didn't belong on the stage, that you could reach some semblance of acceptance or racial equality by basically doing quality work on stage, and the white people would appreciate you that way. Gregory, on the other hand, knew he was put on this earth to do more than just make people laugh. He wanted to make a difference. As he reached increasing levels of stardom, Gregory became more aware about how comedy can be used as a weapon to fight against racism. In 1962, Gregory was approached by the NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers to appear at a voter registration rally in Jackson, Mississippi. As he became increasingly involved in the movement, he realized he didn't have as much time to dedicate to his professional career. Some even felt that Gregory was beginning to take himself too seriously, and that would come as a detriment to his comedy career. In a 1964 interview for Playboy, Gregory said, "Well, these critics who feel I'm destroying myself as an entertainer, all they know is show business. They're concerned nightclub-wise, not news-wise. A political reporter would never say, I'm taking myself too serious. You see, there comes a time when you have to decide what you are and what you want. The way I see it now, I'm an individual first, an American second, and a Negro third, but I'm a Negro before I'm an entertainer." Emil Raymond, the author of the monograph Stars for Freedom, Hollywood Black Celebrities and the Civil Rights Movement, details Gregory's commitment to the black community. Gregory, more than any other celebrity in the 1960s, risked arrest and served jail time for civil rights causes. Gregory was always just a phone call away when it came to other activists, and they didn't hesitate when it came to getting advice from one of the country's top social critics. Gregory's increased role in the activism led to him getting shot in 1965 during the Watts riots in Los Angeles. In Chicago, Gregory became involved in the protest against Chicago school segregation. After being arrested for organizing a series of his own protests against the school segregation outside of Mayor Richard Daley's home, Gregory promised to run against Daley in the 1967 mayoral race. As an independent, Gregory ran a write-in campaign designed to shed light on the corruption of the Democratic Party, much like the people are writing Kanye West in for the 2020 presidential election. Gregory's attempt to translate his stardom into political influence caught the attention of the FBI, who had been keeping watch on Gregory since the early 1960s. They continued to monitor Gregory's campaign as they claimed his comments on the Bureau and the government were vitriolic. Unfortunately for Gregory, Daley was reelected by a landslide, but Gregory was even more inspired and riled up and announced his candidacy for the President of the United States. On the campaign trail, Gregory routinely spoke out against the Vietnam War, but also made his critiques about the limitations of the two-party system known.
The two-party system is so corrupt and immoral, they cannot solve the problems confronting the masses of the people in this country.
Corruption, political power, and capitalism were also talking points. Carl Shipley, chairman of the Republican Central Committee, called Gregory a racist black power candidate and called his campaign un-American in concept. Shipley praised the America's two-party system. It's interesting because this is the same issue that many Americans have voiced concerns over, especially now, considering the 2020 election cycle. Many blacks felt like the Republican and Democratic politicians have failed to address the desegregation and other civil rights issues. This inspired black voters to search for answers outside of the two major political parties, an answer that Dick Gregory might have had. According to the African American Intellectual History Society, Gregory fully leaned into the being labeled as a truth teller, not straying away from what made audiences gravitate towards his comedy. Gregory often used crass humor and shocking public statements to surprise and inform at the same time. People weren't used to hearing information brought to them like this before. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump used similar tactics during his 2016 presidential campaign. Trump didn't campaign like a politician, neither did Gregory. While condemning the two major political parties, Gregory did collaborate with the new party, which was connected with the left and the Peace and Freedom Party. This came from the anti-war and civil rights movements during the 1960s. Gregory was often dismissed as a serious presidential candidate. Despite this, he always found a way to make national headlines. An example of this would be the time he filed a court injunction against President Johnson for excluding him from national security briefings. It was also the time where Gregory produced counterfeit $1 bills replacing George Washington's face with his own. Author of the article, Paper Money, Lauren Gatch claims that more than 1 million copies of the bills were produced and put out on the market. The article also suggests that the exact number is impossible to confirm, but the FBI and Secret Service were put on notice because of it. For a brief period, vending machines and a few other appliances accepted the fake money. Somehow, Gregory was able to avoid being charged for counterfeiting. In response to the situation, Gregory joked that the bills couldn't really be considered U.S. currency because everyone knows a black man will never be on a U.S. bill. Gregory's campaign and views gained support from college campuses. The young people felt a connection with Gregory, much like the millennials that felt Bernie Sanders was speaking directly to them. The paper at Rutgers University encouraged students to opt out of the system by voting for Dick Gregory, who's running a symbolic campaign against the very power structure that ignores us. As Gregory's supporters grew, so did the FBI's pursuit of Gregory. J. Edgar Hoover took note of the comedian's, quote, extremely violent statements of a revolutionary nature, unquote, and claimed he had sympathy for known communists, black extremists, and revolutionary activists. In 1978, it was discovered that J. Edgar Hoover sent a message to Martin W. Johnson, who at the time was a special agent in charge of the Chicago FBI office. Hoover stated that the comedian had traveled all over the country preaching black nationalist extremism, hatred, and violence. He went on to say that Gregory uses his reputation as a comedian to make sure his vitriolic statements would be reported by the press. In addition to this, Hoover said that Gregory had made personal attacks on the President of the United States, the director of the FBI, and FBI agents. When Gregory found out what happened, he defended himself by saying, "I was making lectures on college campuses. Colleges don't pay you to preach violence and hate. What I was saying was that one day we were going to find out that one of the most dangerous men in this country was J. Edgar Hoover, and we would probably find out that Lyndon B. Johnson was one of the worst tyrants." Methods of intimidation and threats were commonly used by the FBI to take down black activists. To them, Gregory had way too much influence as a political commentator and civil rights activist. After the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, the FBI and several other government agencies wondered who would take the place as the leader of the civil rights movement, and Gregory became the leading candidate. Stokely Carmichael, Muhammad Ali, and James Brown were other names that were thought of. The 1968 presidential election ended with Republican Richard Nixon defeating Democratic Hubert Humphrey. Shortly after, in classic Gregory fashion, the comic staged a swearing-in ceremony. As president in exile, declaring that whenever the current occupant of the White House fails to respond to the just demands of human need, the independent army will bring their concerns to the Black House. When Dick Gregory's influence became too much for the government to handle, they kept a watchful eye on Gregory's campaign. We've seen this before where a voice gets too powerful and starts telling the masses things they aren't supposed to hear. Gregory was someone who always played by his own rules and spoke for the people while doing so.